The Impossible Order. November 8th, 1944. 0900 hours. A cold, clinging fog saturates the fields outside the village of Morville-le-Vicq, France. Inside the cramped steel confines of an M4 Sherman tank nicknamed Cool Stud, Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers can taste the metallic tang of fear in the air, a scent mingling with diesel fumes and the damp wool of his uniform. The world outside is a muffled gray void, the fog a shroud that deadens sound and hides the enemy. For 3 days, his unit, the 761st Tank Battalion, has been fighting its way through this hellish landscape of mud and hedgerows. 3 days since they were promised a quick, clean fight. 3 days of watching their tanks burn. A violent concussion rocks the 30-ton vehicle, not a direct hit, but close enough to make the hull resonate like a tuning fork. Loose ammunition rattles in its racks. His gunner, PFC Jimmy Williams, curses under his breath. "They've got us zeroed, Sarge." Rivers doesn't need the confirmation. He can feel it. He squints through his periscope, the view a milky blur. The Germans are out there, dug in with the one weapon they all dread, the high-velocity 88mm gun. It's a phantom, a ghost that kills from 1,000 yards away. The 761st's intelligence had suggested only light resistance, but intelligence was wrong, dead wrong. Another shell screams past, the sound of tearing linen followed by a deafening crack. This one is closer. Rivers feels a sharp, hot sting in his leg. He looks down. A piece of shrapnel, a sliver of white-hot steel no bigger than his fingernail, has torn through the tank's thin floor plate and sliced deep into his thigh. Blood, dark and thick, begins to soak through his trousers. It's a serious wound, deep enough to cripple a man. The order crackles over the radio, the voice of his company commander, Captain David Williams. It's the order they've all been waiting for. Fall back, pull back and regroup. But as Rivers reaches for his own microphone, he sees it. Through a momentary tear in the fog, he sees the men of the 26th Infantry Division pinned down in a ditch, leaderless. They had been advancing behind his tank, using it for cover. If he pulls back now, they will be systematically slaughtered. The choice is instantaneous, brutal, and absolute. Obey a direct order to save himself and his crew, or defy it to save the infantry. Abandon the men who trust him, or charge headlong into a perfectly laid trap from which there is almost no chance of survival. His fingers tighten around the microphone switch. His blood is pooling on the steel floor. The German gunners are reloading. What does a man do when the only right decision is also a death sentence? This is the story of a promise made by a nation to its forgotten sons, and a promise made by those sons to themselves. It is the story of men who were told they were not fit to fight, who were trained for years for a war they were never meant to see, and who, when finally unleashed, fought with a fury that stunned their allies and terrified their enemies. They were the first African-American tankers to see combat in World War II. They fought through the mud of Lorraine, the frozen forests of the Ardennes, and across the Siegfried Line into the heart of Nazi Germany. They were told their fight was for freedom, but they had to fight for the right to fight in the first place. Their commander, the flamboyant and controversial General George S. Patton Jr., called them his first ever black tankers. The Germans, who learned to fear the sound of their engines, gave them another name. They called them the Black Panthers. This is the story of the 761st Tank Battalion, and the 183 consecutive days they spent on the front lines, a record for which they would pay an unimaginable price in blood. It's a story of impossible odds, of a revolutionary weapon that was not a machine, but a group of men. Men like Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers, bleeding in his tank, facing an impossible choice. His decision on that foggy morning would not only determine the fate of the soldiers trapped in that ditch, but it would also become a legend. The first act in a saga of heroism so profound, it would take the United States Army more than 50 years to fully acknowledge it. To understand how they reached that desperate crossroads, we must go back to a divided nation, a segregated army, and the genesis of an audacious and dangerous idea, to create a weapon that would shatter not only the German lines, but the very color line that defined America itself. The story of the 761st is not just a forgotten chapter of World War II. It is a testament to the war that had to be won at home before the war abroad could even begin. Their journey to that foggy field in France was longer and more arduous than that of any other American unit. It began not in the landing craft approaching Normandy, but in the sweltering heat of the American South, in a training camp where the enemy was not a foreign army, but the very system they had sworn to defend. They were an experiment, a political gamble born of desperation and grudging necessity. They were issued the same tanks, the same weapons, and the same uniforms as white soldiers, but they were given a different unspoken burden. The weight of an entire race's reputation rested on their armored shoulders. Every victory, every failure, every act of courage, and every moment of fear would be judged not on its own merits, but as a referendum on the capabilities of 16 million black Americans. Before they ever fired a shot at the enemy, they had to survive an army that saw them as inferior, that housed them in segregated barracks, and that believed at the highest levels of command that they lacked the intelligence, the courage, and the fortitude for armored warfare. Theirs is a story of two wars, the one against the Third Reich and the one against the United States of America. A war within a war. To understand the crucible that forged the 761st Tank Battalion, one must first understand the bedrock of prejudice upon which the United States military was built. In 1941, as the world plunged into total war, the American war machine was a rigidly segregated institution. The prevailing doctrine, codified in a 1925 Army War College study titled "The Use of Negro Manpower in War," was a masterwork of racist pseudoscience. It concluded, with the full authority of the military establishment, that black men were inherently subordinate, mentally inferior, and temperamentally unsuited for the rigors of modern combat. They were, the report argued, prone to mental cowardice, lacked initiative, and were best suited for manual labor, building roads, digging latrines, loading cargo. They were to be servants to the war effort, not warriors within it. This wasn't merely a reflection of civilian society's prejudices. It was an actively maintained military policy. Of the hundreds of thousands of African Americans who served in World War I, the vast majority were confined to service roles. The few combat units that were formed, like the famous 369th Infantry, the Harlem Hellfighters, were almost invariably loaned to the French Army, as many white American officers refused to serve alongside them. The Hellfighters served with incredible distinction, spending more time in continuous combat than any other American unit, but their heroism did little to change the institutional mindset. After the war, the Army largely reverted to its old ways, systematically dismantling black combat formations. The message was clear. In the eyes of the War Department, the black soldier was a liability, not an asset. But the dawn of the Second World War presented a new, undeniable reality. This would be a different kind of conflict, a global, mechanized war of unprecedented scale, demanding the total mobilization of the nation's industrial and human resources. And within that nation were nearly 13 million African Americans, a vast, untapped reservoir of manpower. Civil rights leaders like A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, saw the hypocrisy. How could America claim to be fighting for freedom and democracy abroad while denying it to its own citizens at home? Randolph threatened a massive march on Washington in 1941, a move that would have been a catastrophic embarrassment for the Roosevelt administration, as it positioned itself as the leader of the free world. The pressure was immense, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt relented, issuing Executive Order 8802, which banned racial discrimination in the defense industry. This political victory cracked open the door for black participation in the military, but only slightly. The Army, forced to act, reluctantly agreed to create new black combat units. It was a decision born not of moral awakening, but of political expediency and the looming specter of a manpower shortage. The concept of an all-black tank battalion was particularly radical. Armored warfare was the apex of modern combat, a complex, high-stakes symphony of machinery, communication, and tactical aggression. It was considered the exclusive domain of the most capable, intelligent, and courageous soldiers. To entrust this role to men the Army had officially deemed inferior was, to many in the Pentagon, unthinkable. The problem, as the generals saw it, was catastrophic failure waiting to happen. They pointed to the abysmal performance of some black infantry divisions in World War I, failures caused not by a lack of courage, but by laughably inadequate training, incompetent white leadership who expected failure, and the psychological burden of fighting for a country that treated them as second-class citizens. The fear was that a failing black tank unit would not only waste precious equipment and lives, but would also provide a high-profile "I told you so" moment, justifying the Army's segregationist policies for generations to come. The crisis was therefore twofold: a strategic crisis of needing more combat soldiers, and an ideological crisis that pitted military necessity against deeply entrenched institutional racism. It was into this hostile environment that the 761st Tank Battalion was officially activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. The men who filled its ranks were a cross-section of black America. They were sharecroppers from Mississippi, factory workers from Detroit, college students from New York. Some were drafted, others volunteered, drawn by the promise of serving in a prestigious combat role and a deep-seated desire to prove the racists wrong. They knew with a certainty that their white counterparts could never comprehend that they were not just fighting for their country. They were fighting for their dignity. The severity of the challenge they faced was monumental. The Army's bureaucracy placed countless obstacles in their path. They were issued second-rate equipment for training. They were denied access to officer candidate schools in the same numbers as white units. And they were placed under the command of white officers, many of whom were Southern segregationists who privately, and sometimes openly, expressed their contempt for the men they were supposed to lead. The entire experiment was designed with a high probability of failure. The prevailing attitude was not if the black tankers would fail, but when. The mounting crisis on the battlefields of Europe, however, was about to change the equation. By 1944, with Allied armies grinding their way across France, the demand for trained armored units was becoming insatiable. The Army was running out of tanks, but more importantly, it was running out of men. Suddenly, the forgotten experimental battalion training in the backwoods of Louisiana and Texas looked less like a political problem and more like a desperately needed solution. The question that lingered in the halls of the Pentagon was a haunting one. Had they created a fighting force or a disaster? The Devil's Jaw, the weapon that the men of the 761st would take to war, was the M4 Sherman tank. To the American public, nurtured on a diet of newsreels and propaganda posters, the Sherman was a symbol of indomitable industrial might. It was the chariot of liberation, the steel fist of democracy. And in many ways, it was a remarkable machine. Over 49,000 of them would be built, a staggering number that testified to the genius of American mass production. The Sherman was a masterpiece of logistics and reliability. Its Continental R975 radial engine, an adaptation of an aircraft engine, was relatively easy to maintain in the field. Its transmission was robust. Its simple design meant that it could be repaired quickly, often under fire, by crews with basic mechanical training. In a war of attrition, the ability to put a damaged tank back into the fight in hours, rather than weeks, was a decisive strategic advantage. Furthermore, it was a versatile platform. Armed with a 75mm main gun, it could fire a potent high-explosive shell, making it devastatingly effective against infantry positions, machine gun nests, and unarmored vehicles. It was relatively fast for its size, with a top speed of around 25 miles per hour, allowing it to exploit breakthroughs and perform the sweeping flanking maneuvers central to American armored doctrine. Inside, the 5-man crew, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and assistant driver bow gunner, had more room and better visibility than their German counterparts, reducing crew fatigue and improving situational awareness. For the first few years of its service, fighting against older German models like the Panzer III and early Panzer IV, the Sherman was more than a match. It was, for a time, the king of the battlefield. But by the time the 761st landed in France in the autumn of 1944, the battlefield had changed. The king was facing a new, terrifying breed of predator. The Germans, responding to the shock of facing the Soviet T-34 on the Eastern Front, had initiated a technological arms race, producing a new generation of armored fighting vehicles that fundamentally outclassed the Sherman. The two most formidable were the Panzer V, known as the Panther, and the Panzer VI, the infamous Tiger. To compare a Sherman to a Panther was to compare a hunting knife to a broadsword. The Panther's main armament was a long-barreled, high-velocity 75mm KWK-42 gun. The physics were brutally simple. The Panther's gun fired a heavier projectile at a much higher speed than the Sherman's 75mm. This immense kinetic energy meant it could punch through the Sherman's frontal armor from over a mile away. The Sherman's gun, by contrast, could not penetrate the thick, sloped frontal armor of the Panther at any range. The disparity was horrifying. Sherman crews who survived encounters with Panthers often reported seeing their own shells, fired from as close as 200 yards, simply bounce off the German tank's glacis plate like pebbles. The armor disparity was just as severe. The Sherman's design prioritized speed and manufacturability over protection. It had, at its thickest point, about 76 millimeters, or 3 inches, of frontal armor, which was mounted vertically, a flat plate that presented a perfect target. The Panther, on the other hand, featured 80 millimeters of frontal armor, but it was sloped back at a sharp 55-degree angle. This simple geometric innovation, borrowed from the T-34, was revolutionary. The effective thickness of a sloped plate is much greater than its actual thickness. An incoming shell had to travel through far more steel to penetrate it. More importantly, the sharp angle dramatically increased the chance of a shell simply deflecting or ricocheting harmlessly into the air. The Tiger was even more fearsome. A 57-ton behemoth with over 100 millimeters of flat frontal armor, its legendary 88mm gun was a modified version of the world's most effective anti-aircraft and anti-tank cannon. The 88 could destroy a Sherman from well over a mile and a half away, long before the Sherman was even in range to fire back. Facing a Tiger in a Sherman was not a fight, it was an execution. American tankers were not ignorant of these lethal shortcomings. They developed grim nicknames for their own vehicle. Ronson, after the popular cigarette lighter, because of its tendency to burst into flames with the slogan, "Lights up the first time, every time." Or Tommy Cooker, a British term for a trench stove. The Sherman's propensity to burn was due to its use of a gasoline engine and, more critically, the way it stored its ammunition. The shells were often stowed in unprotected racks high in the turret and along the sides of the hull. A penetrating hit was highly likely to ignite the ammunition propellant, resulting in a catastrophic explosion that would incinerate the crew. Later models, including some used by the 761st, incorporated wet stowage, surrounding the ammunition racks with a water glycol mixture to reduce the risk of fire, but the tank's reputation for burning was already seared into the minds of the men who fought in them. This was the technical reality that awaited the 761st. They were armed with a reliable, mass-produced, but technologically inferior weapon. They would be sent into a fight where the enemy could kill them long before they could effectively fight back. American armored doctrine attempted to compensate for this with numbers and tactics. The idea was that a platoon of 5 Shermans could use their superior speed and maneuverability to flank a single Panther or Tiger, getting a shot at its weaker side or rear armor. But these textbook tactics rarely survived contact with the muddy, hedgerow-choked reality of the French countryside. More often than not, it meant a head-on slugging match, a contest the Sherman was destined to lose. The solution, born of grim necessity, was courage. It demanded that Sherman crews continue to advance, to close the distance, to maneuver under withering fire, knowing that their survival depended not on their armor or their gun, but on their skill, their nerve, and the hope that they could land a lucky shot before the enemy landed a fatal one. It was a devil's jaw, and the men of the 761st were about to drive straight into it. The maverick, the hero, and the general. An army is more than its machines. It is a living organism shaped by the will and character of its leaders. For the 761st Tank Battalion, 3 vastly different men would converge to define its destiny. A quiet, determined white colonel who became their fiercest advocate. A fiery black sergeant who would become their soul. And a profane, pearl-handled, pistol-wielding general who would become their patron saint and their greatest publicist. The first, and perhaps most crucial, was Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates. In an army rife with prejudice, Bates was an anomaly. A West Point graduate, a career soldier, he was assigned command of the 761st in 1943 while it was training at Camp Hood, Texas. He was not a crusader for racial equality. He was a professional soldier tasked with a job. But unlike so many of his peers, Bates judged men not by the color of their skin, but by their performance as soldiers. What he saw in the 761st impressed him deeply. He saw men who were disciplined, motivated, and desperate for a chance to prove themselves. He drove them relentlessly in training, pushing them harder than any white unit, because he knew they would be judged by a harsher standard. He learned their names, their strengths, their weaknesses, and in return, he earned something that few white officers in the segregated army ever achieved: the absolute, unconditional trust of his black soldiers. He became more than their commander. He was their shield against the army's institutional bigotry. When a local sheriff in Texas arrested one of his men on a trumped-up charge, Bates personally went to the jail, drew his sidearm, and freed his soldier. He fought the bureaucracy for better equipment, for more training time, for basic human dignity. He believed in them, and in doing so he gave them the one thing they needed most: the belief in themselves. If Bates was the battalion's mind, its heart was a man named Ruben Rivers. Born in Oklahoma and raised in poverty, Rivers was a natural leader, a man possessed of a quiet intensity and an almost supernatural calm under pressure. He was one of the original members of the battalion, rising quickly to the rank of Staff Sergeant in command of his own tank. He was not a large man, but he radiated an aura of unshakable confidence that inspired the men around him. He was a master of his craft, knowing every nut and bolt of his Sherman tank, every nuance of tank gunnery and tactics. But it was his character that set him apart. In his personal letters, he spoke not of glory or hatred for the enemy, but of a simple, profound desire to do his job well and bring his men home. He possessed a fierce, protective loyalty to his crew and the infantrymen who depended on him. He saw the bigger picture, that their performance would be a testament. His personal motivation was deeply rooted in this understanding. He wasn't just fighting Germans. He was fighting a centuries-old lie about the courage of black men. Failure was not an option, because for him, and the men like him, it would mean a betrayal of their entire race. He was the embodiment of the battalion's unofficial creed, to come out fighting, no matter the odds. The third figure in this trinity was the force of nature, who would give the 761st its chance. General George S. Patton Jr. Patton was a walking contradiction. A brilliant, audacious, and deeply flawed military genius, he was also an unabashed racist who held the same backward views about African Americans as most of his contemporaries. In his private diaries and letters, he used racial slurs and expressed his belief that black soldiers were inferior. Yet, on the battlefield, Patton was the ultimate pragmatist. He worshipped one thing above all else: victory. He didn't care about the color of a soldier's skin if that soldier could fight. By the fall of 1944, Patton's Third Army was locked in a brutal, grinding war of attrition in the Lorraine region of France. The autumn rains had turned the landscape into a quagmire. His divisions were exhausted, and he was desperately short of tanks. When the 761st Battalion became available, earmarked for his command, Patton saw not a social experiment, but a fresh, highly trained armored unit that he could throw into the meat grinder. Before committing them to battle, Patton insisted on personally inspecting the unit. He had them perform drills, he reviewed their training records, and he spoke with Colonel Bates. He was impressed by their discipline and their sharp appearance. On November 10, 1944, he assembled the entire battalion and delivered one of his famously profane and inspirational speeches. "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army," he began, his voice raspy and high-pitched. "I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army."
"I don't care what color you are, so long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of bitches."
He concluded with a promise and a threat. "Everyone has their eyes on you and is expecting great things from you. Don't let them down, and damn you, don't let me down." For the men of the 761st, it was a pivotal moment. Despite the condescending tone, it was a direct, unambiguous vote of confidence from the most famous and feared combat general in the U.S. Army. For 2 years, they had been told they weren't good enough. Now, Old Blood and Guts himself was telling them he needed them, that he believed in them. It was the validation they had been fighting for. They were no longer an experiment. They were now Patton's Panthers, the forging of a weapon. The 761st Tank Battalion wasn't just created, it was forged. Its transformation from a controversial idea on paper to one of the most resilient armored units in the European theater was a grueling 2.5-year ordeal. This was not the typical training pipeline for an American unit. It was an extended, punishing process of invention and refinement, a deliberate effort to build a weapon that was not only tactically proficient, but psychologically unbreakable. The Army establishment, skeptical of their potential, subjected them to a period of training far longer than that of any comparable white unit, scrutinizing their every move, waiting for the fatal flaw to emerge. The process began in the suffocating humidity of Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, in April 1942. The initial cohort of soldiers was a mix of draftees and volunteers from across the country, men who had to first be taught the basics of soldiering before they could even look at a tank. They learned to march, to shoot, to salute. But they also learned the harsh realities of the Jim Crow Army. Their barracks were ramshackle, their facilities inferior to those provided for white soldiers on the same base. They were subjected to daily indignities and racial slurs from white officers and MPs. The nearby towns were hostile territory. This environment was part of the process, a test of discipline and morale under constant psychological pressure. From the very beginning, the battalion's leadership understood that to succeed, they had to be perfect. The training regimen they developed was brutal. Physical conditioning was relentless, pushing the men to the limits of their endurance in the Louisiana heat. Technical education was exhaustive. These were men, many from rural backgrounds with limited formal education, who had to master the complex inner workings of a 30-ton war machine. They spent hundreds of hours in classrooms, studying engine mechanics, radio procedure, and gunnery theory. They learned to disassemble and reassemble the 30 and 50 caliber machine guns blindfolded. They memorized the intricate dance of loading, aiming, and firing the 75mm main gun, drilling until the 5-man crew could act as a single fluid entity. In early 1943, the battalion moved to Camp Hood, Texas, the Army's premier tank destroyer center. It was here that the forging intensified. Camp Hood provided vast ranges for live fire exercises and tactical maneuvers. The process was one of incremental, painful progress. They started with individual tank training, learning to drive the Sherman over rough terrain, to navigate by map and compass, to communicate effectively over the noisy intercom system. A misstep could be fatal. A tank throwing a track or bogging down in mud could become a sitting duck. A breakdown in communication could lead a 30-ton vehicle into an ambush. The next step was platoon-level tactics. They practiced the art of fire and maneuver, with 2 tanks providing covering fire while 2 others advanced. They drilled on how to react to an anti-tank gun, how to coordinate with infantry, how to use terrain for cover and concealment. These were not abstract exercises. They used live ammunition, creating a realistic, high-stress environment where mistakes had immediate consequences. Setbacks were frequent. Tanks broke down. Radios failed. Men made errors in judgment. Each failure was dissected in harsh after-action reviews. There was no room for excuses. This period also saw the arrival of a figure who, for a time, became a crucial part of their story. Second Lieutenant Jackie Robinson. Before he broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball, Robinson served as the morale officer for the 761st. He was a phenomenal athlete and a charismatic leader, but he was also a man of unbending principle. He used his position to fight for better treatment for the black soldiers, challenging the base commander over segregated seating at the post exchange. His time with the 761st was cut short when he famously refused to move to the back of a segregated military bus, leading to a court-martial. Though he was ultimately acquitted, the Army had had enough of him and granted him an honorable discharge. Robinson's defiant stand, however, left a lasting impression on the men. It was a stark reminder of the battle they were fighting off the field, and it stiffened their resolve. Under the command of Colonel Bates, the battalion was honed into a razor's edge. Bates was a perfectionist. He ran surprise inspections at all hours. He held competitions between the companies to foster a spirit of intense rivalry and pride. He personally oversaw the development of their unit insignia, a snarling black panther, and their motto, "Come out fighting." This wasn't just branding. It was the creation of an identity. They were not just soldiers. They were the Black Panthers. This identity was their armor against the racism that surrounded them. When white units would taunt them, the men of the 761st would respond with a silent, disciplined professionalism that was in itself a form of defiance. The clock was ticking. The invasion of Normandy had happened. The war in Europe was reaching its bloody climax. The 761st's long, arduous apprenticeship was about to end. The weapon, forged in the fires of Louisiana and Texas, was finally deemed ready. But the ultimate question remained. Would it shatter on its first impact with the enemy? The Red Ball Express to hell. By the autumn of 1944, the Allied war effort in Europe was facing a crisis of its own success. The stunning breakout from the Normandy beachhead following Operation Cobra had sent the German army reeling across France. Patton's Third Army, in a lightning advance, had covered hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks. But this rapid advance had stretched the Allied supply lines to the breaking point. The primary logistical artery, a massive, round-the-clock truck convoy system known as the Red Ball Express, was struggling to keep the front-line armies supplied with the lifeblood of modern warfare: fuel, ammunition, and food. As Patton's tanks pushed deeper into the Lorraine region near the German border, they began to run out of gas. The Blitzkrieg ground to a halt. This operational pause gave the Germans a precious opportunity to regroup. The disorganized units fleeing across France were reformed and reinforced with fresh troops and heavy equipment. They fell back to a series of formidable defensive positions, including the ancient fortresses around the city of Metz and the formidable West Wall, or Siegfried Line, along the German frontier. The character of the war changed almost overnight. The freewheeling pursuit across open country devolved into a brutal, head-on slugging match in the worst possible conditions. The weather turned against the Allies. A cold, relentless rain began to fall in September and did not stop for months. The rolling fields of Lorraine turned into a vast sea of mud, a glutinous, tank-trapping mire that made movement off the few paved roads nearly impossible. This channeled the American advance into predictable corridors, straight into the sights of expertly concealed German anti-tank guns. The forests were dense, the terrain hilly, and the fog a constant blinding presence. It was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. American casualties began to mount at an alarming rate. Divisions that had landed on D-Day were exhausted and under strength. The steady flow of individual replacements was not enough to fill the gaps. The optimism of August gave way to the grim, attritional reality of October. This was the strategic context into which the 761st Tank Battalion was about to be thrown. After landing at Omaha Beach in early October 1944 and collecting their new Sherman tanks, the battalion began its own long journey across France. They were part of the new wave of men and materiel being rushed to the front to restart Patton's stalled offensive. For the men of the 761st, the journey was surreal. They passed through French towns and villages where the locals, seeing black soldiers in American uniforms for the first time, greeted them with a mixture of curiosity and celebration. It was a stark contrast to the oppressive racism they had known in America. For a brief moment, they felt like the liberators they were meant to be. Their destination was the assembly area for the 26th Infantry Division, the Yankee Division, to which they would be attached. The psychological state of the men was a tense mixture of anxiety and fierce determination. They had trained for this moment for over 2 years. They were arguably one of the most thoroughly prepared armored units in the entire U.S. Army, but they were also green. They had never been under fire. They carried the immense weight of expectation from Patton, from the Army, and from Black America. They knew there were no second chances. In the final days of preparation, they performed maintenance on their tanks, cleaning the guns, checking the engines, and loading the ammunition. They received their final briefings, studying maps of the small, obscure French villages they were tasked with capturing, places like Moyenvic, Vic-sur-Seille, and Morville-les-Vicq. The names meant nothing to them then, but they would soon be etched forever into the battalion's history. The final intelligence assessments were dangerously optimistic. The reports suggested that the German forces in their sector were demoralized and preparing to withdraw. The 761st's first mission was framed as little more than a mopping-up operation, a chance to get their feet wet against a weakened enemy. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The Germans had no intention of withdrawing. They had spent weeks preparing a layered defense in depth, studded with 88mm anti-tank guns, hidden machine gun nests, and minefields. They were waiting on the eve of their first attack. The men gathered in the cold to listen to their chaplain and to write what might be their last letters home. There was a quiet solemnity, the calm before the storm. They had endured the indignities of segregation, the rigors of training, the long journey to the front. Everything had led to this point. They had been forged, polished, and aimed at the heart of the Third Reich. Now, all that was left was to pull the trigger. They were committed. There was no turning back. As they climbed into their tanks in the pre-dawn darkness of November 7th, 1944, they were acutely aware that they were driving off the edge of the map into a future that was terrifyingly unknown. They were about to enter hell, trial by fire. The attack began at dawn on November 7th, 1944. A cold, persistent drizzle fell from a slate-gray sky, turning the fields around the town of Moyenvic into a slick, treacherous morass. The plan was straightforward. The Shermans of the 761st would lead the way, blasting a path for the infantry of the 26th Division. The tankers, buttoned up inside their steel hulls, felt the familiar lurch as the drivers engaged the gears, and the battalion began to roll forward. The silence of the morning was soon replaced by the roar of 70 radial engines and the clatter of steel tracks. For the first few minutes, the advance was deceptively easy. They crossed the open ground, their confidence building with every yard. And then, all at once, the world erupted. From concealed positions in the town and the surrounding woods, German anti-tank guns opened up. The first crack of a high-velocity 88mm gun was unmistakable, a sound that would haunt the survivors' nightmares. A Sherman from Able Company, commanded by Lieutenant Louis Long, was hit first. The 80mm shell sliced through the tank's frontal armor as if it were cardboard, and the Sherman erupted in a geyser of orange flame and black smoke. The attack faltered. The green tankers, under fire for the very first time, were stunned by the ferocity and accuracy of the German defense. The optimistic intelligence reports had been a lie. This was not a mopping-up operation. It was a carefully prepared ambush. The radio net dissolved into a cacophony of panicked voices. Tanks bogged down in the mud, becoming stationary targets. Machine gun fire raked the hulls, the sound like a steel drum solo played with hammers. In the command tank, Colonel Bates struggled to regain control, ordering his companies to press the attack, to use fire and maneuver. But in the chaos and confusion of a first battle, textbooks and training went out the window. It became a primal fight for survival. It was in this maelstrom that Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers began to distinguish himself. As other tanks hesitated, looking for cover, Rivers pushed his tank, Cool Stud, relentlessly forward. His voice over the intercom was a steady, calming presence for his crew. He directed his gunner onto target after target, his 75mm gun barking, spitting high explosive shells into German machine gun nests. When his tank bogged down in the mud, directly in the sights of an anti-tank gun, Rivers and his crew worked furiously under fire to attach a tow cable to another tank and pull themselves free. Instead of retreating to safety, he immediately re-entered the fray, racing to the aid of another company that was pinned down. The fighting raged for 2 days, a brutal, town-by-town, street-by-street grind. The 761st took heavy casualties, but refused to break. They learned the brutal calculus of armored warfare on the job. They learned to advance by shooting the town, pouring a ceaseless torrent of machine gun and cannon fire into every building, window, and pile of rubble that could hide an enemy soldier. On November 8th, outside the village of Morville-les-Vicq, the battle reached a new level of intensity. The fog was thick, visibility was near zero, and the Germans were dug in deeper than ever. This was the moment that would define the legend of Ruben Rivers. As his tank spearheaded the assault, it struck a Teller mine. The explosion was deafening, lifting the 30-ton vehicle into the air and slamming it back down. The blast tore off the right track and sent a shower of shrapnel into the hull. Inside, the crew was dazed. Rivers himself took a deep, jagged gash in his leg from a piece of flying steel. His leg was on fire, the bleeding profuse. The tank was crippled, a sitting duck. Through the fog, Rivers could see German soldiers, emboldened, beginning to advance on their position with Panzerfausts, shoulder-fired anti-tank rockets. The radio crackled with Captain Williams' order to abandon the tank and fall back. What happened next was witnessed by the men of the 104th Infantry, who were cowering in a ditch nearby. Disregarding the order and his own grievous wound, Ruben Rivers ordered his crew to stay and fight. He manned the key .50 caliber machine gun on the turret, a position completely exposed to enemy fire. As the German infantry advanced, Rivers opened up, the big machine gun bucking in his hands, scything through their ranks and forcing them to retreat. For the rest of the day, Rivers refused evacuation. Using his crippled tank as a stationary pillbox, he provided covering fire for the infantry, directing his main gun and machine. Guns with lethal precision. He refused morphine for his pain, knowing it would dull his senses. His single-handed stand held the line and allowed the trapped infantry to be safely withdrawn as night fell. The act was so selfless, so far beyond the call of duty, that his captain immediately put him in for a medal. It was the first, but it would not be the last. Act of breathtaking courage from the sergeant of Cool Stud. The battalion had survived its trial by fire. They had paid in blood, but they had not broken. They had come out fighting. and they were just getting started. A debt of honor. The stand at Morville-les-Vicq was not an end, but a beginning. For the next week, the 761st continued its relentless assault. On November 16th, near the town of Grueling, Ruben Rivers would once again place himself at the forefront of the battle. Despite the still unhealed wound in his leg, which had become badly infected, he had repeatedly refused to be evacuated from the front. That morning, his company was ordered to take a heavily defended German position. 2 other American tanks had already been knocked out trying to lead the way. Colonel Bates got on the radio and spoke to Rivers's company commander, Captain Williams. According to the after-action report, Bates suggested that Williams lead the next attack. But Williams's voice came back, laced with grim certainty. "Sir, I'm not going to lead it. Sergeant Rivers is going to lead it." Rivers accepted the mission without hesitation. He took his tank to the head of the column. As they advanced across an open field, 2 German anti-tank guns opened up. A shell struck Rivers's tank, killing his gunner and loader instantly and wounding the rest of the crew. Rivers himself was hit again, this time with shrapnel that tore into his other leg. Blinded in one eye by the blood streaming down his face, he managed to get his 2 surviving crewmen out of the burning Sherman. Then, under a hail of machine gun and mortar fire, he made his way to another tank, took command, and directed its gunner to destroy one of the German anti-tank positions. He was still not finished. He spotted the second German gun. Knowing he had to mark its position for the rest of the company, he ordered his new crew to open fire on it, a move he knew would draw the enemy's full attention to his tank. As his gunner engaged the target, the German 88 fired back. The shell struck the turret. Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers was killed instantly. He was 25 years old. Rivers's sacrifice was not in vain. His actions saved countless American lives and allowed the advance to continue. But his story was just one among many. The 761st fought on through the brutal winter of the Battle of the Bulge, where they raced to relieve the besieged 101st Airborne at Bastogne. They pierced the vaunted Siegfried Line, fighting their way through a nightmarish landscape of concrete, dragon's teeth, and interlocking pillboxes. They pushed into Germany, and in May 1945, they were among the first American units to link up with Soviet forces on the Steyr River in Austria. Along the way, they participated in the liberation of Gunskirchen Lager, a sub-camp of the Mauthausen concentration camp, bearing witness to the ultimate horror of the Nazi regime they had fought so hard to destroy. By the end of the war in Europe, the 761st had been in combat for 183 consecutive days. They had inflicted over 130,000 casualties on the enemy and captured, destroyed, or liberated more than 30 major towns. But the cost was immense. The battalion suffered nearly 50% casualties, with 34 men killed and 260 wounded. They had lost 71 tanks. They had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that the racist theories of the Army War College were a contemptible lie. They had not only fought, they had excelled, earning the respect of the infantry units they supported and the fear of the enemy they faced. Yet, in the immediate aftermath of the war, their extraordinary record was met with a familiar silence. While other units were celebrated with parades and decorations, the 761st was largely ignored. They were deactivated in Germany, and the men were sent home, not as heroes, but as black men returning to a still segregated America. The promised presidential unit citation for their outstanding performance was quietly buried in bureaucracy for decades. Ruben Rivers was awarded a posthumous Silver Star for his actions, but his commanding officers, including Colonel Bates and Captain Williams, had recommended him for the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest award for valor. Their recommendation was lost, ignored, or deliberately blocked. In the 1940s, no black soldier from World War II received the Medal of Honor. The men of the 761st spent the next 50 years fighting their last battle, the battle for recognition. They held reunions, wrote letters, and lobbied politicians, refusing to let their story die. Finally, in 1978, after a long and difficult campaign, President Jimmy Carter awarded the 761st the Presidential Unit Citation. But the fight for Ruben Rivers continued. In the 1990s, a study commissioned by the U.S. Army concluded that a climate of systemic racial discrimination had prevented black soldiers from receiving the Medal of Honor during the war. On January 13, 1997, more than 52 years after his death, President Bill Clinton posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor to Staff Sergeant Ruben Rivers. His surviving sister received the medal on his behalf in a White House ceremony. The legacy of the 761st Tank Battalion is etched not only in the battlefields of Europe, but in the fabric of American history. Their courage under fire provided undeniable proof of the capabilities of black soldiers, a critical factor that contributed to President Harry S. Truman's decision to desegregate the armed forces in 1948 with Executive Order 9981. They were the trailblazers, the tip of the spear in a two-front war. They fought for a double victory: victory over fascism abroad and victory over racism at home. Their story is a timeless reminder that the most powerful weapon in any arsenal is not forged from steel, but from the unbreakable will of ordinary men who, when faced with an impossible choice, choose to come out fighting.